Hello there. My name is Chris Bielby. I'm a retired teacher who's had a lifelong interest in natural history. In fact, I've been birdwatching for more than 60 years now. Following early retirement, I got more involved with conservation, particularly cetacean surveys and conservation with Orca, amongst other organisations, carrying out surveys and giving presentations to various passengers, particularly on cruise ships. Since then, I've been providing my own presentations for more than 10 years, and this is one of the ones that is actually my favourite. I hope you enjoy it too. So if we can make a start straight away, the topic today is Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution by natural selection. Now, in this presentation, I'll explain how Charles Darwin's ancestors, his background and his contemporaries all contributed to his groundbreaking theory of evolution through natural selection. I'll also outline some of the evidence he gathered, as well as more recent knowledge we've acquired to support his theory. In the early 17th century, Archbishop James Ussher worked out from the dates and lifespans in the Bible that the Earth was created in 4004 BC, a Sunday, 23rd of October to be precise. That figure was the official stance of the church for many years. He also calculated that Adam and Eve were driven from paradise on the 10th of November the same year, and Noah's Ark touched down on Mount Ararat on the 5th of May, 2348 BC. Now, over the following centuries, many scientists began to question this view as more scientific evidence emerged of the huge antiquity of the Earth in geological terms. By the 18th century, evolution was not an entirely new concept. It really was just a mechanism of change which was not understood. Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck invented the term biology. He formulated a theory of evolution, suggesting that characters acquired by animals during their lifetime would be passed on to their offspring. This was called Lamarckian evolution. For example, giraffes' long necks were acquired by stretching for the highest leaves. If you like, blacksmith's strength would be passed on to his children. Even in the early 19th century, there was much opposition to the idea of evolutionary change. Baron Georges Cuvier was a great naturalist, but he opposed any theory of evolution. He thought that species were immutable and had been since creation. This line was supported by the church, of course, which was eager to prosecute for blasphemy anyone who questioned it, especially any theories stating that man was just another animal. Now, on the left, we have Erasmus Darwin. He was the grandfather of Charles. He was a medical practitioner and a scientist in his own right. And he wrote in his book Zoonomia in 1794 that he believed that animal species changed over millions of years. He was a member of the Lunar Society, along with other lunatics such as James Watt, Joseph Priestley, and Josiah Wedgwood, all eminent scientists in their own right, of course. He worked on several ideas of evolution himself, but never actually came to any conclusion, a style of wild theorizing that Samuel Taylor Coleridge termed Darwinizing. On the right, we have Charles's father, Dr. Robert Darwin. He was an imposing man, standing 6'2" and weighing 328 pounds. He was a successful medical practitioner and a firm but supportive man who wanted Charles to have a career in the church. Initially, he opposed Darwin joining the Beagle, and it was only the intervention of Josiah Wedgwood, Charles's uncle, that convinced him to allow Charles to join the voyage. So we have the young Charles Darwin, born 1809 near Shrewsbury to a very wealthy family with a history of interest in the sciences. In 1817, he was sent to boarding school, at which he did not excel, but did develop an interest in natural history, especially beetles, which he collected. He spent much of his time hunting and exploring the countryside, but also riding the 20 miles to his uncle Josiah Wedgwood's house, where he enjoyed the company of his 4 female cousins, including Emma. In 1827, he was sent to Christ's College, Cambridge, to study for the church. Once again, he did not excel, but he did continue to develop his interest in natural history, as well as enhancing his hunting and shooting, skills which later became useful during his collecting expeditions from the Beagle. By his own admission, he did waste a lot of his time drinking and carousing with the Glutton Club, but despite this, he gained his BA degree in 1831. Now, beetles were Darwin's first love, and even as a child, he collected things, he made a lot of sketches, he became an avid collector, and he developed the skill of detailed observation and note-keeping, which was to serve him well in his subsequent travels, and which, of course, are the qualities of good scientists even today. At Cambridge, Charles was influenced by many people, notably Professor John Stevens Henslow, on the left. He inspired Darwin's interest in botany and wildlife in general. Darwin was known as the man who walks with Henslow. They went on many expeditions in the locality, studying and collecting wildlife specimens. On the right is Adam Sedgwick, professor at Cambridge, who interested Darwin in geology and who also took him on many expeditions, collecting and recording rocks and fossils. Sedgwick was to become a staunch supporter and a close friend of Charles in later years. Now, Charles read the journals of Alexander von Humboldt. He was the founder of modern geography. Darwin described him as the greatest scientific traveller of all time. He'd explored South America with botanist Aimé Bonpland, mapping 1,700 miles of the Orinoco. He discovered the ocean current flowing up the western coast of South America, which was later named after him, the Humboldt Current. Another major influence was Charles Lyell on the right, who wrote The Principles of Geology, in which he stated that the Earth was more than 300 million years old. He became a great friend of Charles Darwin and influenced his thinking on evolution. In fact, it was Lyell's book which Darwin read during his long spells of seasickness as the Beagle sailed towards Brazil, and which influenced his thinking on how not just the Earth, but living things could change over time. Now, this is Captain Robert FitzRoy. He was the master of the Beagle. He joined the Navy at the age of 14 and rapidly impressed with his ability and intellect, becoming captain of the Beagle at the age of only 23 on its first voyage to South America. His navigational skills led him to be selected to lead his second voyage to South America, to survey the coast and harbours, and to verify the longitude readings with greater accuracy. FitzRoy wanted to widen the scientific scope of the voyage and sought to recruit experts from other fields onto the expedition. It was Professor Henslow who recommended Darwin to FitzRoy, and it was only after they'd met and established a good relationship that Darwin was offered the post as naturalist and companion. This was despite FitzRoy thinking that Darwin had a weak nose. He believed strongly in appearance being an indicator of strong and noble character. Also, FitzRoy was an aristocrat and a Tory, descended from an illicit liaison between Charles II and the Duchess of Cleveland, while the Darwins were upper-class Whigs and Liberals. FitzRoy was a very religious man and expert surveyor and hydrographer in his own right. He was occasionally troubled by bouts of depression and mood swings, even during the voyage. He was a pioneering meteorologist who later organised the system of weather stations, enabling reliable weather forecasting for mariners. In fact, recently, Sea Area Finisterre was renamed FitzRoy in honour of his achievements. In 1837, he was awarded the Royal Geographical Society Gold Medal. In 1851, he was elected to the Royal Society, Darwin being one of his sponsors. He eventually became governor of New Zealand between 1843 and 45 and tried to protect the Maoris from illegal land claims by British settlers, which made him deeply unpopular there. Even to the end of his life, he was troubled by Darwin's theory, which he still thought heretical. Sadly, his depressive nature led to his suicide in 1865, but he has a life well worth studying for those who are interested in this remarkable man. Now, this is HMS Beagle, a 10-gun bark of 242 tons, only 90 feet in length. Darwin commented on how well made she was, from the finest mahogany, without realising that she'd been practically rebuilt as a result of severe rot the previous year. She had a full crew of 74, many of whom were volunteers from the previous voyage, but including scientists and the 3 Fuegians whom Captain FitzRoy had brought back from Tierra del Fuego on his first voyage of exploration. His intention was to return them to their home as missionaries, but this failed miserably. Well, this is a map of the route taken by the Beagle during her historic voyage around the world, which took 5 years in all, setting off on the 27th of December 1831 and not returning until the 2nd of October 1836. And by far the most important part of that, as far as Darwin was concerned, was the exploration of South America, because here he was breaking new ground. Most of the other areas they sailed through had already been explored and examined by naturalists, but here he was breaking, he was a bit of a vanguard. So this is the route of the Beagle in South America. From the Cape Verde Islands, they went to Salvador, Rio de Janeiro, Montevideo, on to Tierra del Fuego, and the main purpose of the voyage was to map the coastline and harbours of South America. But Darwin took the opportunity to explore inland at every port and collect specimens. On his expeditions into the Pampas, he collected many rheas. Darwin initially called them ostriches. What we had for dinner today would sound very odd in England. Ostrich dumpling and armadillos, he noted. The red meat of the big bird was like beef, and that armadillos, when pulled out of their shells, tasted and looked like duck. Obviously, his attitude to wildlife at that time was closer to chefs like Gordon Ramsay than David Attenborough. Indeed, later on in the voyage, gauchos caught another smaller rhea, which Darwin initially dismissed as a youngster of the familiar species. It was only later, after it had been skinned and eaten by the crew, that he realised how different it was. He packed up the skin, preserved it, and then sent it back to London, where it was examined and mounted for the Museum of the Zoological Society by John Gould, who realised it was a distinct species new to science, so he named it the Lesser Rhea, Rhea darwinii. More of Gould's influence later. Darwin's genius was in recognising that the 2 distinct species lived in different regions and were adapted to slightly different habitats, a pattern he'd later apply to his Galapagos finches. Once again, Darwin studied these uniquely South American animals, the armadillos, and not just how tasty they were, but how unique their body form was, so that when he later found fossils of huge extinct mammals the size of a small car, and which he recognised as belonging to a similar group to the armadillo, but much, much larger. This was the glyptodont, reconstructed here, which was thought to be extinct about 10,000 years before, along with many other of the megafauna, coinciding with the arrival of humans into South America. He observed herds of guanaco, wild relative of the llama, one of several members of the camelid group of mammals unique to South America. Darwin noted the parallels in body form as adapted to the environment in comparison with the Old World fauna, such as camels living in similar habitats. He found fossil bones of another huge animal, which was obviously related to the tree-climbing sloths, but much, much larger. This was Megatherium, or giant ground sloth, which was the size of an elephant, unique to the Americas, and once again extinct between 10 and 12,000 years ago. He collected many more bones and fossils, which he shipped back to his friend and mentor, John Henslow, in Cambridge. Darwin entrusted the description and identification of many of his fossils to a brilliant young anatomist called Richard Owen, who subsequently founded the British Museum of Natural History. On his expeditions high up in the Andes, he found fossil mollusk seashells on the left and ammonites on the right, which belonged to the cephalopod family, like nautilus and squid, both families being strictly marine creatures. These stimulated heated debate aboard the Beagle about Noah's Great Flood. Darwin's study of geology with Professor Sedgwick confirmed his belief that the Earth was far older than the Church professed, and the shells proved that only massive movements of the Earth's crust could have lifted them to those altitudes. On leaving the Beagle Channel and Tierra del Fuego, they sailed west into the Humboldt Current, flowing up northwards up the western coast of Chile and Peru, and carrying nutrients in its cold water. As these cold waters are pushed upwards by the continental shelves, they reach sunlight, which triggers a bloom of algae, which provides the base of massive food chains, culminating in the seabirds, fishes, and cetaceans for which these waters are famous. Every 7 to 10 years, however, the Humboldt Current changes course away from the coast, causing an El Niño year, and the loss of the nutrient-rich cold waters cause catastrophic collapses in the population of fish and everything which depends on them, especially the seabirds. It also has effects on the climate of the whole Pacific Ocean and surrounding land masses as far as Asia and North America. And now we know that the whole world also reacts to some extent to El Niño events in the Pacific. As he sailed up the coast and approached the equator, they reached the Galapagos Islands. Darwin went ashore and marvelled at the abundant and tame wildlife, noting many species were unique to each small island, and none of them had any fear of human beings, having never experienced them before. They were volcanic islands showing a succession of development, from initial eruption, through dormancy and colonisation, to erosion and decline, eventually disappearing back below the sea again, where they still provided reefs rich in wildlife. The youngest islands, some still active volcanoes, are in the west. To the east, the older, eroding calderas. The youngest are very rugged, covered in lava fields, home of marine iguanas. The oldest are crescents of volcanic caldera rim, covered in forests of giant dandelion-like trees. Darwin eventually realised that they were probably initially colonised by accidental migration from South America, but different islands held slightly different varieties of what appeared to be the same species, but adapted to suit their particular habitats. We now know that this progression of volcanic activity is due to the movement of tectonic plates on which the islands sit as they move over a hotspot in the underlying mantle, steadily flowing towards the South American coast. Now, Galapagos is Spanish for tortoise, and the governor of the islands told Darwin he could tell which island a particular tortoise came from by the shape of its shell. This impressed Darwin, and he guessed that each island's tortoise had distinctly shaped shells linked to their food and lifestyle. Darwin surmised that they probably originated from a single species, but each island favoured slightly different variations, resulting in the diversity of shell shape and lifestyle. This is a typical Galapagos giant tortoise. Note the normal cowl on the shell. No need to reach upwards, as it's a grazing feeder feeding on the ground. On some islands, the tortoises were lighter and faster, as they had to rush out from cover to feed and return to the shade before the heat of the day cooked them. They had longer legs and lighter shells. On the more verdant islands, the tortoises didn't need to rush, so became larger and slower. And this is the Pinta Island subspecies. Note that it's got a high cowl above its neck, allowing it to reach and browse on the flowers of cactus and taller shrubs, the only food available on Pinta Island. And this was a design specific to that one island. And this, of course, is Lonesome George, the last of his species, born in 1910, died in 2012. For decades, he was the rarest animal on Earth, being the only one of his species. But on the plus side, he did get to meet Sir David Attenborough before he died. Although these giant tortoises had been known for many years, very few had found their way to the scientists of the West. This was despite many attempts by several collectors. The problem was that tortoise is apparently very tasty and easy to keep, and after a month without fresh meat, the sight of what looked like a giant meat pasty wandering around the decks of ships was just too much to bear for the hungry sailors, and they rapidly disappeared into the pot. Many ships routinely stocked up on tortoises from the islands for this very purpose, and indeed the Royal Navy stocked many isolated islands with tortoises with the intention of sustaining any shipwrecked sailors. They were lucky not to go the way of the dodo, which was similarly very tasty and easy to catch. And in fact, on one of the islands, the Navy ships took away between 500 and 800 tortoises on one trip. Now, this is John Gould, I mentioned earlier, who was receiving and classifying many of Darwin's specimens in England. He was also a great artist, as can be seen from this painting of Darwin's tanager. And it was he who first noted the similarities of Darwin's finches when he received them as specimens, and he drew Darwin's attention to them. Darwin noted the Galapagos hawk, which was endemic to the Galapagos Islands, but with close relatives on the mainland of South America. It had adapted to prey almost totally on the marine iguanas, and was very, very tame. In fact, Darwin mentioned that he had to practically knock it off its perch with a stick. Now, Darwin's notes are here, comparing land iguana of South America with the marine iguanas of the Galapagos. He realised that they had so much in common that the marine iguana must have descended from land iguanas, which had floated on debris from South America before making landfall on the Galapagos. Now, reptiles are able to survive long periods without food and fresh water, but obviously mammals cannot. He noted that the small changes in anatomy of the marine iguana were a result of necessary changes in behaviour and lifestyle in order to survive. It also explains why there were no native mammals on the Galapagos at all. So the marine iguana, a unique marine lizard adapted to feed on seaweed. It has a flattened snout to allow grazing on short marine algae, powerful long claws to cling onto rocks and resist waves. It has glands in its nostrils which concentrated and extracted salt and then sneezed it out. Its behaviour included diving for up to an hour and at depths down to 20 metres, before having to come back out onto land to warm up again. The main problem is getting chilled to the extent they don't have the strength to climb out of the water again. Amazingly, in El Nino years, every 7 to 10 years, when the Humboldt current switches off, the algae declines and much of it dies. This means up to 90% of the marine iguanas will starve to death. But some are adapted to decrease in size by 20%, and this includes shrinking their skeletons, which are partially reabsorbed. This reduces their need for food and conserves energy until conditions improve again, enabling them to survive when others cannot. Now, Darwin continued his research as the Beagle completed her circumnavigation until 1836, when he returned home with his huge collection of specimens. He married Emma Wedgwood, his cousin and daughter of Josiah Wedgwood, the famous pottery designer. They eventually had 10 children, despite Charles's failing health, and they had a long and very happy marriage. In 1839, they moved to Down House, Darwin's home for the rest of his life, which is now a museum in Kent. It was on Galapagos that the seeds of his theory were germinated, but it was here that Darwin formulated his theory of evolution through natural selection, and then spent 20 years accumulating evidence and specimens to support it. He was reticent to publish as he was very aware that his ideas would upset Emma, who was deeply religious, as well as the established church and many of his friends. He carried out research into many fields and communicated with many animal breeders, steadily building up his knowledge. For example, varieties of pigeons were well known to Darwin. He recognised the mechanism of selective breeding to produce desired characteristics in many domesticated animals. After all, if man could select parents with particular features to breed more of the same, surely nature could do that as well. It led him to realise that nature could provide similar influences to change populations, especially in isolated communities like the Galapagos Islands. Darwin re-examined his specimens of Galapagos finches. Although anatomically similar, the finches of different islands had different beaks, adapted to the different food types available. Again, Darwin surmised, probably originating from a single species, but evolving to survive in those different environments. Heavy beaks to crack hard seeds on the left, progressing to lighter insect-eating beaks on the right. Basically, he reasoned that individuals with advantageous features suited to a changed environment would survive better and breed more, so producing more of the offspring with those advantageous features. Those without those features would be less likely to survive to breed, and so the poor features would slowly die out in the population. Over time, the population changes and a new species can evolve. In other words, this is survival of the fittest, or a better way of putting it probably is survival of the best fitted. So the finches had been forced by the different habitats on each island to evolve into different species, with beaks adapted to feed on different types of food available. And this is evolution through natural selection. Now, Darwin felt he needed much more evidence showing evolutionary progression before he dared publish, and he spent over 20 years accumulating it. One piece of good fortune was the discovery of an Archaeopteryx fossil, which provided one of the first missing links which supporters of evolution had been seeking. A flying dinosaur. Note the prints of the feathers, the pentadactyl limb more of later, the bird-like beak but with teeth. Here was the missing link between dinosaurs and modern birds. This is a reconstruction of Archaeopteryx, the flying dinosaur, which shows the beginning of bird-like features, including feathers. However, it also had teeth, which birds do not, and many other reptilian features. It is now known that birds are the surviving direct descendants of dinosaurs. In fact, recent fossils and recent discoveries have shown that even some of the big raptorial dinosaurs had signs of feathers on their skin, and many other features associated with birds now. So that link is becoming more and more firm. Another missing link was the duck-billed platypus. The first examples brought to the West were thought to be hoaxes made from several animals stitched together. It is in fact a monotreme mammal which lays eggs. The other one is the echidna, the spiny anteater. They suckle their young with milk from mammary glands with only rudimentary nipples, more like a little trough. Both are only found in Australia, like most marsupials, which are the pouched mammals. Marsupial young do not develop internally attached to a placenta, but externally attached to a nipple inside the mother's pouch. The journey from birth canal when they are very tiny to the pouch is very difficult, and it's the main hazard in their development. So marsupials, if you like, are the prototype mammals. They're very primitive, and they colonised the whole world, reaching Australia just before it was separated from the rest of Southeast Asia by rising sea levels. This meant that these primitive mammals were protected from the more competitive and successful modern placental mammals, which displaced them everywhere else in the world. So marsupials evolved to fill all the ecological niches in Australia in their own unique way. For example, kangaroos instead of gazelles, koalas instead of monkeys and apes, wallabies and wombats instead of rodents like rabbits, predators like Tasmanian devils and thylacine, Tasmanian wolf, instead of fox and wolf. Again, Darwin found support from his old professor, Adam Sedgwick, but also a major influence and supporter of Darwin's idea was Joseph Dalton Hooker, pictured on the left. He was a great explorer and friend of Darwin. He eventually became director of Kew Gardens, the great botanical gardens in London, succeeding his father. Another great influence was the Reverend Thomas Malthus, pictured right, who famously wrote in his Principles of Population that human populations were controlled by war, famine, or disease. This idea was grasped by Darwin, who realised that similar factors of attrition could affect animal populations in the wild. Now, Darwin was a great letter writer and was communicating with many scientists of the day, including a certain Alfred Russel Wallace. He was a self-employed collector. He didn't have the benefits of wealth or background, but he paid for all his expeditions by sending specimens home to museums, private collectors and zoos. In 1844, he went to the Amazon collecting wildlife specimens. In 1854, he began his exploration of Indonesia and the Far East, where he stayed for 8 years. It was he who noted the dividing line crossing the Indonesian archipelago between Old World fauna and the unique species living in Australasia, which included the marsupials. This is now called the Wallace Line, and it extends between Borneo and Sulawesi along the Lombok Straits. To the west live Asian fauna and modern mammals. To the east, only Australasian fauna, comprising the primitive marsupial mammals, which were relics and only survived because they were not exposed to the competition, because the land bridge had been broken by rising sea levels. But Wallace also hinted at a greater movement of the Earth's surface, possibly predicting Wegener's theory of continental drift, which was not published until the early 20th century. In 1855, he wrote an essay on the law which has regulated the introduction of new species. This opened up a dialogue with Darwin. In 1858, he formulated entirely independently a theory of evolution by natural selection, which was almost identical to Darwin's. He spent only 2 days writing it down while suffering from a fever, then sent it to Darwin, asking him to forward it to Lyell if he thought it was good enough. Darwin did so immediately. Darwin was taken aback by it, saying, "If Wallace had my 1842 sketch, he could not have made a better short abstract. Even his terms stand as heads of my chapters." Now, Darwin was loath to publish in case people thought he had behaved in a paltry manner. Fortunately, Hooker and Lyell intervened, and on the 1st of July 1858, both Darwin's and Wallace's papers were read jointly to the Linnean Society of London, and they were not greeted with any enthusiasm at all. This spurred Darwin to publish after much encouragement from his friends. Wallace always gave precedence to Darwin and described his Origin of Species as the Principia of natural history, equating it with the work of Isaac Newton in physics. He said, Mr. Darwin has given the world a new science, and his name should stand above that of every philosopher of ancient or modern times. This was described as one of the noblest and most attractive episodes in the history of science, and it is nice to see that Wallace is now getting the credit that he deserves. When Darwin eventually published his theory of evolution through natural selection on the 24th of November 1859, published by his good friend Murray, in which the basic principle became known as the survival of the fittest, it was generally accepted as a well-reasoned explanation of the natural world. The first edition sold out almost immediately. However, to avoid controversy, Darwin carefully avoided making reference to the evolution of humans. Eventually, in 1871, he published The Descent of Man, in which he proposed that humans had evolved from ancestral apes, and he immediately faced massive opposition from the church and establishment. He and his supporters were mercilessly parodied by Vanity Fair, etc. Now, Darwin's theory had many weaknesses, which he acknowledged, because he could have no knowledge of the mechanism of hereditary change. Now, it's deeply unfortunate that he didn't see the work of Gregor Mendel, which had in fact been published in 1866. Now, Mendel was an Austrian monk, working in Czechoslovakia. He carried out many breeding experiments, notably on peas. He realized that each physical characteristic is controlled by two factors we now call genes, one from the father, one from the mother, not as previously thought, a simple blend of mother and father's characteristics. He formulated the laws of inheritance. His work, first published in 1866, was overlooked until late in the 19th century, when its enormous significance was recognized. Unfortunately, he died before his contribution was recognized. Now, Mendel also noted that occasionally mutations appeared in an otherwise normal set of offspring. These mutations, or sports as animal and plant breeders call them, were often used to breed new varieties artificially. If Darwin had known about this work, he would have seen that these same mutations could rapidly produce evolutionary change if they were exceptionally well adapted to a changed environment. Now, Mendel's work revealed that the range of variation within a population allows for adaptation to changing conditions. Even in extreme attrition, when most of a population succumbs, some individuals may have an adaptation or immunity and survive. Only they will be able to breed and so pass on the successful gene to their offspring. The new population is changed to be better adapted to the new environment. It has evolved. Now, you will recognize, no doubt, this normal distribution curve, and this particular one shows continuous variation from the extremes at each end of a population, and this one is height. So the majority of people are within an average height range within the middle of the graph. There are some people who are naturally shorter and some people who are naturally taller, but the average is in the middle. If an environment changes, for instance, if it suddenly becomes a great advantage to be shorter for some reason, then the population will change. Those at the taller end will eventually die out, they will fail to breed. Similarly with the taller side of average, and the shorter side of average will be more successful. And so that distribution curve will actually decrease in size due to the reduction in population, but it will also move to the left slightly. So the average becomes closer to the more favoured extreme. If it's an advantage to become tall, the same thing happens, but the graph moves to the right. If an animal is well adapted to an environment which doesn't change, it will not evolve. It doesn't need to. And excellent examples of this would be, for instance, a crocodile that's been around for many hundreds of millions of years and is so good at its job, it has no need to change. And the environment that it lives in is pretty well constant. so there's no need to evolve further. Sharks are another example. With the exception of Megalodon, which was just too big from preying on probably reptiles, swimming reptiles like ichthyosaurs, and was absolutely huge, but it's just a big great white shark. And the other great white sharks that have plenty of food to feed, they don't need to change. They're so good at their job, they stay where they are. And that is a feature of evolution. It only happens where some constraint comes in, making change necessary. Now, if we look at other evidence that we have, all the vertebrates or backboned animals show many common structures. And one of the most obvious is what we call the pentadactyl limb. And if we look at the bottom drawing on this, this is our arm, showing the typical structure of it. We have one bone, the humerus, two bones, the radius and ulna, and then our digits, our fingers, five sets. If you look at the top, we have the bat that has the same structure, a humerus, a fused radius and ulna, and then its 5 digits are extended and the web of skin stretches between them to make its wing. Even inside the flipper of a whale, we have the same structure. We have one bone, two bones, and then 5 sets, all enclosed within the cartilage flipper of the giant whale. If we look at the human, the next hand down in the middle there, the basic structure, like ours. If we look at the horse, we see that the horse has evolved much further. It, in fact, has lost 4 of its toes on each foot, and it runs around just on one toenail, its hoof. But the remnants of those other 5 bones are still in existence there. If you look at a mole, the sharp eyes amongst you might see something's gone wrong here. There are 6 digits there. And in fact, what looks like a thumb is a cartilaginous outgrowth. It's not a bone. We've still got the 1, 2, 5, but that cartilaginous growth helps to make a paddle-like foot to help it dig. So that structure is common through all the vertebrates. And if we go back to a living fossil fish, the coelacanth, from 350 million years ago, this is called a lobe fin fish. And those lobes contain the prototype skeleton of limbs, which eventually evolved to drag amphibians onto dry land. Now, it was thought to have become extinct with the dinosaurs more than 65 million years ago. And its survival could be due to the fact that it lives in very deep water, and its blood and internal fluids are so oily as to be unpalatable to most predators. But they are quite commonly caught, particularly in the Indian Ocean now. Now, the evolution of the eye was a real bugbear. The anti-evolutionists always argued that it was inconceivable that such a complex structure could evolve. It had to be the result of divine creation. If we look at the diagrams here, we see the top diagram is a human eyeball. It's a hollow sphere. It has a cornea at the front. It's 2 chambers. The front chamber contains aqueous humour. The rear chamber contains vitreous humour. And the lens separates, and there's an iris to control the amount of light at the left, with the optic nerve leaving at the right-hand side. In the middle, an insect eye is completely different. It's made up of hundreds, maybe thousands of tiny conical little cells, lenses with a light receptor at the end. So an insect gets a sort of pixelated view of the world, which can be very detailed and very accurate. If we look at the bottom, we've got the eye of an octopus. And once again, you see the structure. 2-chambered, lens dividing the 2 chambers, large chamber at the back, smaller chamber at the front, protected by a cornea with an iris built in. It is almost identical to the mammalian eye. And yet, the cephalopod, the octopus eye, the octopus is a mollusk. It's the same family as oysters, mussels, snails, slugs. So this is an example of parallel evolution, resulting in the same end result. And it is now possible for us to trace the evolution of the eye through all its stages in many species and many families until we end up to the fantastic organ that we have today. Another piece of evidence is called recapitulation. And this is, if you like, following our own development. As a fertilized egg, we start off as a single cell. That single cell becomes a ball of cells. And then in case of vertebrates, backboned animals, that folds almost like a little miniature Cornish pasty, with the ridge around the outside becoming the notochord or the spinal column. And at the first stage of development on this diagram, we'll see that all those 4 embryos look almost identical. And they actually show the beginning of little gill slits at the fish stage of our evolution. The middle stages begin to show limb buds, much like the lobe-finned fish becoming an amphibian, just tiny little buds beginning to develop. And it's only in the later stages that we become recognizable as the species that we are. Now, evolution is still continuing in many different ways. And the classic example, particularly pertinent in Victorian times, was linked with the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Now, the peppered moth is a very common moth and survives due to camouflage. Now, in a natural, clean world, pre-Industrial Revolution, most trees were covered with lichen, which is very rough textured and pale, and it covered the tree bark. And the pale varieties of peppered moths always survived due to their fantastic camouflage. However, when the Industrial Revolution arrived, lots of air pollution occurred with soot and smoke, and this killed the lichen on the trees, and the tree bark became black and sooty. And then suddenly a dark variety, which had been very, very rare in the natural world, suddenly became the best camouflaged. The pale ones suddenly became the ones that were exposed and obvious and vulnerable. And so in these polluted areas, these industrial areas, the best fitted were the dark moths. They survived to breed, and eventually in those areas, they became the predominant species or the predominant variety of the same species. However, in the cleaner areas, the pale ones still predominate because there's no pollution and paler bark to camouflage them. So that's a very simple demonstration, if you wish. And there are many, many others, but we simply do not have time to deal with those. If we now look at the tree of life itself, this is sort of classic illustration. At the very base, bottom left, if you like, we have the most primitive single-celled organisms. They initially came from something not much different from a virus, a piece of DNA capable of replicating itself. But from those, some became more complicated. Some organized themselves into free-swimming little cells, things like amoeba. And then they became colonies like Volvox, you may remember. And then they became even more complicated. And some became specialized in containing special little chloroplasts that would allow them to use the sun's energy to make nutrition and to grow. And this was the plant kingdom evolving. The fungi, which live on decay, seem to be a group on their own. But all the different varieties of plants spin off on the left-hand side of this diagram. On the right-hand side, coming from these primitive single-cell creatures, some of them evolved not to produce energy by photosynthesis, but to eat others who had. So we had, if you like, carnivorous single-celled creatures, zooplankton. And they eventually evolved into many different species, starting with simple invertebrates. We had coelenterous like jelly babies, and annelid worms, then going into invertebrates, which include huge numbers of groups, the insects, the arachnids, crustaceans, many, many groups, extremely successful, and quite possibly our successors as dominant species on Earth, the way things are going. Then we have the vertebrates themselves. These creatures develop the backbone, the internal skeleton. We start off with fishes, then amphibians, then reptiles, then a spin-off from reptiles with a little loop through the dinosaurs, if you wish, to birds, and then to mammals themselves. So we can trace this progression with fossils and indeed to some extent with DNA right the way back. So this is Darwin's tree of life, the popular illustration showing how different life forms evolved from a common ancestor over billions of years, based upon Darwin's basic theory of evolution through natural selection. It shows that all life, including us, evolved originally from simple creatures like bacteria, and that DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, was and is the basic unit of all life on Earth, as it's the chemical which is capable of reproducing itself. So, we've all evolved from a single-celled organism in a living slime. Not a nice thought. But on a brighter note, we're all composed of atoms born at the Big Bang, 13.8 billion years ago, in which the universe was formed, and all the heavy metals and minerals and elements of which we are made. In other words, we are all stardust, and probably have in us at least one atom which has been in the body of any historical person you would care to name. So effective is nature's recycling process on Earth. So this is Charles Darwin towards the end of his life. 2 weeks before he died, in 1882, he wrote a paper about a tiny clam found attached to the leg of a water beetle in a pond in the Midlands. It was his last publication. But for those who like connections, the man who sent him the beetle was an amateur naturalist and a shoemaker called Walter Drawbridge Crick. He eventually had a son named Harry, who himself had a son called Francis. In 1953, Francis Crick, in collaboration with a young American called James Watson, along with Rosalind Franklin and Maurice Wilkins, discovered the structure of DNA and the mechanism of the genetic code, for which the three men won the Nobel Prize. Very sadly, Rosalind had died before the award. But if that isn't a rather spooky link, I don't know what is. I hope you enjoyed this talk, and I'm looking forward to answering questions from you. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris, for that fantastic presentation. We've got a few questions for you. The first question comes from Rosemary, who is in the United States. She asks, how do we date the first human on Earth?
Oh, let's start with a hot one, Rosemary. There's a lot of conjecture on this, and particularly at the moment, because recent research using DNA and other things as well is posing this question. I think basically, historically, the first human, was walking upright. That was the first sort of human step, if you like, literally. Also, the ability to make tools. And this isn't just opportunism, using something that was useful, but actually crafting a tool. And then we have other sort of biological features, the larger brain, the reduction of robustness in the skeleton, things like smaller teeth, smaller brow ridge, sort of physical features. But basically, the earliest human being was probably something like Homo habilis or Lucy, you may have heard of. I actually have another presentation about the evolution of man, the evolution of human beings. And this I deal with in more detail. But I think it's those features as much as anything. And as for dates, well, Homo sapiens, our particular species, we reckon about not much more than 200,000 years. A bit older than those, maybe 400,000 years ago, we had Neanderthals. Before then, perhaps 2.5 million years ago, something like that, we had Homo erectus. And Homo erectus was dominant, two-legged, tool-making, fire-using human type ape man, if you wish, who dominated the earth for 1.5 million years or more, virtually on his own, we think, or maybe with other species contemporary with him. But so it's a very difficult thing to say. But the first signs of humanity, if you like, I think, are those physical abilities of tool making and standing upright. That seems to be the border on that. But it is a massive topic, and it is constantly changing as more fossils are being found, and indeed DNA is now proving to be an absolute revelation in the information that's being brought through. A fascinating topic, and it's very hard to keep up with. I hope that solves your question to some extent, Rosemary.
It certainly does. Thank you very much, Chris. So the next question is from Libby, and she's from the United States, and she asks, do you know where one can see many of the creatures and fossils collected by Darwin? She's assuming that many of them are part of a museum's collection.
Yeah, a lot of his collection eventually went to the Natural History Museum in London, of course, because that's where many of them were processed and preserved. I've no doubt there will be some in Down House in Kent as well, because that also is a museum to Darwin. Certainly, there are specimens in the British Museum, the British Museum of Natural History, which were collected by himself, and with his own annotations, in fact, I believe. So that is that's a good research project for you, I think. I believe also the universities have them as well. I believe some of the museums in the British universities also have specimens.
Perfect, Chris. And the next question is from Benjamin, who is in the US, and he asks, did Darwin struggle to have his work accepted? As at first, when he joined the voyage of the Beagle, he was really only an amateur naturalist, not a full qualified scientist.
Yeah, well, initially, as I explained there, he had some very detailed arguments with FitzRoy, who remained a creationist right to the end. And during his cruise, I mean, a lot of the naturalists at the time were amateurs. They were usually pretty well off, but they were mainly amateurs. It wasn't sort of a profession, apart from people like Alfred Russel Wallace, who had to pay for his own research by collecting specimens from museums. But he was no less brilliant at it. I mean, as I said, his detailed note-taking enabled the research to work. And when he got back, it was although he'd formulated his ideas fairly quickly when he got back, he spent the next 20 years of his life accumulating further evidence and information. He realized what a hot potato this was, and that particularly he didn't want to upset his wife, who was deeply religious, as I said, and many of his friends. And so he realized he needed to have a great width of evidence. And I can only recommend you to read his book, The Origin of Species, if you like. I've got my old copy is there, I don't even see that. But read it and you'll see the efforts he made. So a lot of his research was independent. He didn't have a team, but he was calling upon other experts in their own fields, for instance, the pigeon breeders and so on. I mean, he did his own research. It was he who formulated the theory of how coral atolls formed. He did a lot of research on things like barnacles. So he was doing a lot of his own research. He produced a paper on how earthworms recycle the soil and actually bury ruins and things like that. So he did an awful lot of research himself. He was working independently. He formulated the theory himself. He had the great support of people like Hooker and Lyell and others. But it was all his own work, really. And it was when he spoke to Alfred Russel Wallace, he realized that he had also come to the same conclusions, but without the evidence, and effectively 20 years later than Darwin. So Darwin deserves the precedence that he gets, but also Wallace deserves the recognition for what he did as well. So yeah, he was working on his own, was independent, and as I said, when they read their joint papers, it was met with almost overwhelming apathy in the Linnean Society, and he was spurred then to publish the whole book with the evidence, with the findings, with the illustrations, and that immediately was a sellout, and that immediately brought him to prominence because people realized what an excellent, reasoned publication it was, and that effectively it ticked most of the boxes. Not all, as I mentioned. It is really sad that he did not recognize the work of Mendel, and also that Mendel wasn't acknowledged. But that's really sad, because that would have filled in a lot of gaps and made the case even stronger. Okay, I hope that helps.
It certainly does. Thank you, Chris. The next question is from David, who is in the United States. And he asks, did humans first evolve as a group, or did a single human evolve first and then mate, which passed on his or her mutated genes?
Wow. This is, it seems, I mean, we have a dearth of fossil records, as you know. They're very difficult to find. And East Africa is always regarded as the cradle of humanity because of findings like Homo habilis and Lucy, and now others as well. And at the time that Homo habilis evolved, there were at least another 13 ape men, or ape-like creatures, hominid types. They walked upright. They quite possibly used tools, but that's unlikely. But they certainly walked upright. But they were very robust, very heavily featured, very ape-looking. Whereas habilis was very human-looking. Small, round head with a little larger brain, flatter face, smaller teeth, much more gracile, if you like, graceful. But they are always associated with these manufactured tools. So it probably started with an individual in this tribe of relatively puny apes. In fact, it's quite likely they were very lucky to survive at all, considering who their neighbours were. And so these puny apes suddenly had an advantage. Maybe one discovered that the use of a stone boulder will stand him in good stead if he's facing one of the robust ones. So it was obviously a culture that developed amongst this particular species, which proved to be very beneficial. And it allowed a relatively puny line of these early anthropoids to survive against competition that on the face of it looked much more fierce and more vicious. So it seems to me, it looks as though it may have been a cultural thing initially, and then that culture passed on. The more intelligent were able to develop it and continue it. So yeah, I hope that answers your question there to some extent. So it probably was an individual in the first place, but then, you know, eventually these creatures evolved, they succeeded, they filled this ecological niche, they survived against the odds, and to the extent that some of them eventually tried to migrate out. Now, it wasn't we don't think it was the habilis that made it to that, but later species, particularly Homo erectus, did migrate out of Africa. They went across the land bridges at the top and bottom of what's now the Red Sea into the Middle East, and then spread right around the world as far as Asia and Eastern Asia, Peking Man and all the rest of it, and to the west, even as far as Europe. America was always cut off. The two Americas were always cut off. They'd been isolated by continental drift, and they were free of any human interference until relatively recently. But this migration of erectus was absolutely amazing. And as I say, they were the top hominids, if you like, top Homo types, Homo erectus, that survived for a long, long time and adapted extremely well to their environment and dominated for far longer than any Homo sapiens has, or where things are going or is likely to. So they were around for 1.5 million, maybe up to 2 million years ago. And they themselves, it seems, may have spread out to the islands. Maybe it's thought that they could possibly have been the precursors of the Hobbit, the small race of hominid which inhabited the island of Flores in Indonesia. So it's very, very interesting. And more recent DNA research, they're now finding ways of collecting DNA from even old fossils, old remains, particularly teeth, that gives them some idea of how these things are linked. And this is such a frontier of research now. It is really exciting and fascinating, and you've got to keep your eye on the old page every day to see what else has been found. I hope that helps.
Perfect, it certainly does, Chris. And this is our last question, and it is from Bill, who is in Canada. First of all, he says, thank you for providing this fantastic lecture.
Oh, thank you.
But then goes on to ask, did Darwin consider the dinosaurs' extinction in the theory of evolution? Some have suggested that it has greatly accelerated our evolution.
I believe so. He was very aware that all of the megafauna of South America appear to have died out at the same time. And that coincides with the arrival of the first human beings into South America, which was about 11,000, 12,000 years ago, very recently. And so he realized that. With the dinosaurs, I'm not sure what his own views on that. I actually haven't read that. However, it seems it's certain that if the dinosaurs had not become extinct, we would not be here. The dinosaurs were so dominant in their environment that if they had not become extinct, then that would not have given the little puny mouse and shrew-like mammals that were scudding about, pinching eggs and what have you, they would not have given the opportunity to evolve. They would have been trampled underfoot, if you like. They may still have been there, scudding about in the undergrowth, but it's highly unlikely that the mammals would have evolved to the dominance that they have now, if that extinction hadn't happened. Now, the dinosaur extinction is, of course, only the last of the latest of several. I think there have been 6 great extinctions. And each one, if you like, cleared the decks for the development of the next creature along. Even in our own evolution, when Homo sapiens eventually left Africa, there were several breakouts. One of the first ones was about 120,000 years ago. And some of those reached as far across as into southern China. And we have DNA traces for those. And then they died out. And this was, I think, about 70,000 years ago, when there was a massive volcanic eruption. I think it was the Toba volcano, which erupted and created, if you like, a nuclear winter, which completely killed out that population and every other human north of Africa, out of Africa. So that was one time when it's thought that the human population got down to about 10,000 individuals, but we survived. And then the next breakout was about 60, 70,000 years ago, when, once again, using the same route, either side of the Red Sea, due to changing sea levels and what have you, and that migration went out into Eastern Europe and Asia, and one line followed the coastline right the way around India, Indonesia, as far as Australia. And it's thought that the Australian Aborigines, in fact, are some of the oldest remaining descendants of that breakout, the 60,000 year breakout, because that's when they arrived in Australia. However, in the rest of Europe, the ice ages took over. And although there were Neanderthals already in existence out there, probably evolved from Erectus, I think, those Neanderthals were pushed down as far as the Mediterranean and beyond by the ice sheets. Homo sapiens appears to have been pushed out almost altogether. So it was the next breakout 40,000 years ago that was successful, as far as we're concerned. And from that breakout, modern Homo sapiens got right the way up, all the way around the world, right the way up into Europe, Western Europe, reaching the British Isles, although a forerunner already had been there before the Ice Age. Some had got across the land bridge. This was about 16,000 years ago. Got across the land bridge from Siberia into Alaska, and then down the coast, right the way down into South America, arriving there by about 12,000 years ago. So we have this this route of migration, this route linked with our evolution as well, and this is all being ratified and confirmed by DNA findings that are coming through almost by the minute. And it is absolutely fascinating, and it is throwing up some very, very interesting results about interbreeding between humans and Neanderthals, and also humans and Denisovans, the sort of eastern race of Neanderthal, if you like. And it's thought that every human who's not sub-Saharan African contains about at least 2% Neanderthal genes. Sub-Saharan Africans don't. The most original group being still the Sami, or if you like, the Bushmen of South Africa. They have the original DNA blueprint that is linked to all of us. And it's true, by tracing back, because of all these previous extinctions, that it is more than likely that it was the line, the descendants of one person, what we call the ancestral Eve, if you like, that actually survived and expanded. So, you know, we're all related. And the way that it's traced back, and many other lines sort of broke out of Africa, but it was only that one line descended to that one woman whose gene we can trace through to everybody living today, that makes her the ancestral Eve, if you wish. So it's so fascinating, and as I said, DNA is the way ahead, I'm sure, and we'll see lots more incredible findings coming through in the very near future. It's a very exciting time. Okay, hope that helps.